always been someone who craves isolation. Not in a misanthropic way, but I grew up in a loud house in a crowded city, and silence has always felt like a luxury to me. A few years ago, when I was 24, I found a listing online that felt like hitting the jackpot. It was a volunteer position for a fire lookout tower in the Pacific Northwest. The listing was very clear. You had to provide your own food, the pay was essentially non-existent, and you would be entirely alone for a minimum of 2 weeks. You'd get a radio for emergency contact and daily check-ins, but cell service was a joke. I applied immediately and, surprisingly, got accepted. The tower was located at the end of a grueling 5-mile hike up a steep elevation. When I finally reached it, my legs were burning, but the view made it instantly worth it. It was a classic 10 by 10 foot wooden cab perched on top of 40-foot steel stilts, surrounded by an ocean of green pine trees stretching to the horizon. The first 3 days were pure bliss. I read, I drank terrible instant coffee, and I scanned the horizon with binoculars. It was exactly the reset my brain needed. But the isolation does something weird to your senses. When there's no ambient noise, no cars, no sirens, no hum of electricity, your ears start picking up on every tiny rustle of the wind. On the 4th night, the weather turned. A heavy fog rolled in just before sunset, thick enough that I couldn't see the ground below the tower. It felt like I was floating in a cloud. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound that definitely wasn't the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of metal clinking against metal. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. The sound came again. It was coming from directly below me. Someone or something was touching the steel support beams of the tower. Now, my mind immediately went to bears. They sometimes rub against structures. But then the sound changed. It became rhythmic. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of heavy boots hitting the metal grate of the stairs. Someone was climbing up to the cab. Panic is a cold, paralyzing feeling. I was 40 feet in the air, miles from civilization, trapped in a glass box. I grabbed the heavy maglite flashlight I kept by my bed, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. They reached the top landing just outside my door. The wooden catwalk creaked under their weight. I could see a dark silhouette standing against the frosted glass of the door, completely obscured by the thick fog swirling around them. I waited for a knock. I waited for them to call out, maybe a lost hiker looking for shelter, but they didn't. Instead, I heard the slow, agonizing squeak of the door handle turning. I had locked the deadbolt before going to sleep, and I watched the handle hit the locking mechanism and stop. The silhouette didn't move away. They just stood there. For 10 minutes, which felt like 10 hours, this person stood completely motionless on the catwalk, inches away from me, separated only by a thin piece of wood and glass. I could hear their breathing, heavy, ragged breaths that sounded wet. Then, without a word, the footsteps started back down the stairs. I listened until the sound faded into the fog. I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching that flashlight. When the fog finally lifted, I climbed down to inspect the ground. At the base of the stairs, pressed deep into the muddy soil, were massive boot prints. But the most terrifying part wasn't the prints themselves, it was the pattern. The prints didn't lead toward the tower from the trail. They emerged from the thick, untamed brush behind the tower, and they didn't leave. The prints just circled the base of the stilts over and over before trailing back into the dense, pathless woods. I radioed base camp and lied, saying I had a family emergency. I hiked out that same morning. I still don't know who was on those stairs, but the thought that they might have been watching me from the tree line for days before deciding to climb up, it makes me sick to my stomach to this day. If you're into urban exploring, you know the holy grail of locations are the untouched ones. The places that haven't been vandalized, tagged, or stripped for copper. A few years ago, a buddy of mine, let's call him Dave, got a tip about an abandoned Cold War-era communication bunker in the Midwest. The entrance was supposedly hidden inside a rusted-out agricultural silo on a foreclosed farm. It sounded like complete fiction, but Dave was obsessed, and honestly, so was I. We packed headlamps, respirators, and enough water for a full day, and drove out there on a Saturday. The farm was a wreck. Nature had completely taken over. We found the silo exactly where the tip said it would be. After pulling away some rotted wooden boards inside, we found it. A heavy steel hatch set flush into the concrete floor. It took both of us using a crowbar to pry it open. A wave of stale, freezing air hit us immediately. We clicked on our high-powered flashlights and looked down. A metal ladder descended into absolute darkness. We climbed down, maybe 40 feet, until we hit a concrete floor. The space opened up into a massive, echoing corridor. It was incredible. The bunker was pristine. There were old switchboards, decaying maps on the walls, and rows of metal desks left exactly as they were decades ago. It was like stepping into a time capsule. We spent about 2 hours exploring, moving deeper into the complex. The layout was confusing, a series of branching hallways and blast doors. We were careful to leave glow sticks at intersections so we could find our way back. We were in what looked like a subterranean cafeteria when Dave suddenly grabbed my arm and shined his light down the adjacent hallway.
"Did you hear that?" he whispered. His voice was shaking. I listened. The silence in that bunker was so heavy it almost rang in your ears. But then I heard it too. It was the sound of a chair scraping against concrete. It echoed from somewhere deep within the dark corridors ahead of us. We froze. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe the bunker was settling. Maybe it was a draft. But then we heard another sound. Click, clack. It was the distinct sound of a mechanical keyboard being typed on. Just 2 strokes, loud and clear. We weren't alone. Dave and I didn't exchange a word. We just turned and started speed-walking back the way we came, following our glow sticks. We were trying to be as quiet as possible, our heart rates through the roof. As we approached the second intersection, my blood ran cold. The glow stick we had left there, a bright neon green one, was gone. I shined my light around frantically. It hadn't rolled away. It had been picked up. Before I could process that, Dave pointed his light down a long, narrow service tunnel to our left. At the very end of the tunnel, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam's reach, was our glow stick. But it wasn't on the floor. It was suspended about 5 feet in the air, swaying gently side to side, as if someone was holding it, waiting in the dark. We didn't walk anymore. We ran. We sprinted blindly through the last few corridors, guided purely by adrenaline and memory. I have never climbed a ladder faster in my entire life. We scrambled out of the silo, slammed the heavy steel hatch shut behind us, and ran through the overgrown fields all the way back to the car. We locked the doors and peeled out of there, leaving a trail of dust. We never went back, and we never told anyone the exact location. People always ask me if I think it was a ghost. I tell them no. Ghosts don't need glow sticks. What scares me isn't that a place like that is haunted. What scares me is the idea of someone choosing to live down there in the pitch black, miles underground. This last story
happened to me while I was on a solo road trip through California. I've always been fascinated by ghost towns, places that boomed during the gold or silver rushes and then died just as quickly. I had read about Cerro Gordo, an abandoned silver mining town high up in the Inyo Mountains. It's incredibly remote. You have to drive 8 miles up a treacherous, unpaved, winding dirt road just to reach it. At the time I went, the town was technically privately owned, but there were periods where the caretaker was away and the place was left entirely empty. I drove up there on a Tuesday afternoon. The road was terrifying, sheer drop-offs with no guardrails, but I eventually made it to the top. The town was exactly as advertised, a collection of weathered wooden buildings, an old hotel, a general store, all sitting at 8,000 feet elevation, baking in the sun. I parked my car and spent hours wandering around taking photos. It was dead silent. Not even the sound of birds, just the wind whistling through the cracks in the dry, rotting wood. As the sun started to set, the temperature plummeted. I knew I needed to head back down the mountain before it got completely dark, as driving that dirt road at night would be suicide. I was packing up my camera gear near the old American hotel when I noticed one of the doors to the second-floor balcony was wide open. I could have sworn it was closed when I walked past it an hour earlier. I figured the wind had blown it open, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked into the hotel. The floorboards groaned under my weight, kicking up decades of dust. I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was lined with small, numbered rooms. I walked toward the open door at the end of the hall. When I stepped into the room, I noticed something immediately out of place. The room was empty, except for an old iron bed frame. But sitting perfectly centered on the rusted springs of the bed was a fresh, half-eaten red apple. It wasn't rotting, it wasn't dried out. The bite marks were fresh, the flesh inside still white and wet. My stomach dropped. I realized how vulnerable I was. I was hours from the nearest town, out of cell service, standing in a decaying building with someone who clearly didn't want to be seen. I backed out of the room slowly. As I turned to head down the hallway, I heard a floorboard creak. It didn't come from the room with the apple. It came from the room directly across the hall, room 14. The door was closed. I froze, barely breathing. Another creak, then a soft shuffling sound, like someone slowly dragging their feet across the floor inside that room, moving toward the door. I didn't wait to see the handle turn. I bolted down the stairs, bursting through the front doors of the hotel and sprinting to my car. I fumbled with my keys, practically tearing the ignition to get the car started. As I threw it into reverse and whipped the car around, my headlights swept across the second floor of the hotel. Standing in the window of room 14, looking down at me, was a figure. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person standing perfectly still in the dark window frame. I drove down that mountain road faster than I ever should have. I didn't care about the drop-offs. I just wanted to put as much distance between myself and that town as possible. I've looked into Cerro Gordo since then. It's a popular spot now. Someone bought it and is restoring it. But whenever I see videos of people happily exploring the American hotel, all I can think about is that fresh apple and the realization that in places abandoned by society, the people who remain are the ones hiding from it. That's going to do it for today's stories. Exploring the abandoned can be an incredible thrill, but these encounters are a harsh reminder that when we step off the map, we give up the safety of the crowd. Sometimes, the most terrifying things in the dark aren't ghosts or the paranormal. They are just people who don't want to be found. If you have your own terrifying urban exploration or isolation story, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I might just feature yours in an upcoming video. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more, please hit that like button and subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss a descent into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe and be careful where you shine your flashlight. Good night.
Prince of Darkness.